Chapter 46. The key to what happened. Much happened in that long ago summer of 1914, a summer which in many ways is still with us. The question is, what happened to bring about a world war? There are aspects of the story that always have been puzzling. In a sense this was only to be expected. Enormous quantities of vital evidence have been destroyed precisely because they would supply the answers to our questions. But so much of the past has been recovered by the great scholars of the post-Fisher era that we may be able, now, to fill in the blanks in the reasonable certainty that we have got it right. We know how the conflict between Austria and Serbia burst out into the open. Austria had resented Serbia ever since 1903. When a coup d'état in Belgrade caused a change of orientation in that Balkan kingdom, transforming it from Austrian satellite to Russian ally. We know that in the Balkan Wars that ended in 1913, Austria developed a mortal fear of Serbia. The record is clear that in the middle of June 1914 the Habsburg Foreign Ministry, on orders from its chief, was at work on a memorandum that called for the elimination of the Serb threat, a plan that would require German support. Therein lay the problem. For when Germany's emperor was asked to give his full support of Austria in the middle of June 1914, he declined to do so. The entirely fortuitous assassination of Franz Ferdinand and Sophie, just as the memorandum was drafted, supplied an emotionally powerful argument that led the Kaiser to change his mind. It was pure accident, but as a result of it Wilhelm and his officials extended to Vienna on July the 5th to the 6th the carte blanche that the Kaiser had refused to grant only weeks before. At the time, the blank check did not appear to be as fateful a commitment as it does in retrospect. All that Germany had undertaken was to keep the other European powers from interfering while Austria-Hungary took action against Serbia. The Kaiser and many of his officials saw no risk in making their pledge. They were absolutely certain, and with good reason, that the other countries would do nothing if Austria-Hungary acted quickly. Other German officials, notably Falkenhayn, the war minister, believed that Germany would not be called upon to do anything because Austria-Hungary would not act. Coming out of the July the 5th to the 6th meetings and embarking, as were other key figures on a stage-managed vacation, Kaiser Wilhelm had estimated that it would take between 1 and 3 weeks for Austria-Hungary to dispose of Serbia. Returning from their vacations 3 weeks later, Germany's military leaders found their worst suspicions confirmed. Austria had not finished off Serbia while they were gone. Postponing once again, Conrad, leader of the Habsburg armies, now estimated that his forces would not be ready to march for weeks. He now set the date at August 12th. That was the situation to which Germany's generals returned to begin their informal consultations with one another the last week in July. That is the story of Austria's mortal duel with Serbia in the early part of the 20th century, how it began, and how it moved to its fateful conclusion. How did the duel end? What is significant is that the question is asked so rarely. During the last week of July 1914, Europe seems to have lost interest in the Austro-Serbian War. It had played its part. It had prepared the way. Then to some extent it disappeared from view. The principal actors in the drama that unfolded in Berlin the last week in July were Germany's military leaders. Falkenhayn had told the Kaiser that matters were now out of his, Kaiser's, hands, and the Kaiser seems, at least in part, to have accepted that. Yet at other times he acted and spoke as though he remained in charge. There had been no military coup d'état, yet the Kaiser, and the Chancellor, later in the week deferred to the views of the generals. What had changed at the end of July was that the military were taking an active hand. The blank check had been the Kaiser's policy, though his officers had made no objection to it, and the advice to Austria as to how it should achieve its goals was formulated by the Chancellor, a civilian. Patemon's plan had been for Austria to launch an invasion to crush Serbia so quickly that it would be achieved before the other European powers had time to interfere or even object. It was to be done before the powers were aware that it was starting to happen. It had been Bateman's role to monitor Austria's performance. Austria had not performed. Now the top military leaders were proposing plans of their own. Moltke always had believed that a war against Russia was inevitable, that it was a fated encounter between Germans and Slavs, and that time was on Russia's side, so a preventive war should be initiated by Germany as soon as possible. This was his doctrine now, in the July crisis, and seems to have been the doctrine of his fellow officers in general, as well as of the great general staff as a whole. But the circumstances had to be favorable. Moltke had said this often, as had his colleagues. What were the necessary circumstances? In the Moroccan crisis of 1911, the Agadir affair, Germany had learned that the Habsburgs would not support interests that were merely German. However, they would expect Germany to support them in defense of their own interests. It was, in that sense, a one-way alliance. Only decades before, Prussia had fulfilled its objective of excluding Austria from the rest of the German world. Now, within the convoluted ambiguities and ambivalences of the relationship between Berlin and Vienna, rivals bound together by mutual need, lay the explanation of unfolding events. The Habsburg alliance was vital to Germany's grand strategy. In the war that Moltke saw coming, he needed Austria-Hungary's armies to help defend against Russia, in the initial weeks while Germany was preoccupied with France. So chief among Moltke's requirements for the favorable circumstances for war were several that involved the dual monarchy. The dispute had to start as Austria's, not Germany's, otherwise Austria would not play. At first Austria had to make the running. Its quarrel had to be one that would provoke Russia. At first Germany would appear in the conflict only as Austria's protector. As a result, Russia would then have to attack Germany, or at least it had to appear to the German public that Russia had attacked. Any German general in Berlin at the end of July could see that by sheer luck the stars were in the right position, and that the constellations were unlikely to be so favorable ever again. Moltke was only one of those who said so. So the generals in Berlin in the last week of July were agitating for war, not Austria's war, one aimed at Serbia, but Germany's war, aimed at Russia. What seems to have mystified historians for decades, in attempting to answer all sorts of questions about war origins in 1914, is that there were two wars being proposed that summer, not one. Moreover, the two wars were not entirely compatible with one another. It was something about which Moltke and Conrad were not completely candid with one another. Once hostilities commenced, it would become clear that Conrad needed all of his available troops in order to crush Serbia, while Moltke wanted all Conrad's armies to ward off Russia. Each hoped that, when the time came, the other would give up his war. Conrad desired that Germany merely deter, not actually fight, Russia, while Conrad was destroying Serbia. Moltke insisted that Austria defer its own goals until Germany accomplished its own. The German position became starkly clear on July 31 with mobilization. On that day Wilhelm cabled Franz Joseph a message to which attention rightly has been called by historian Fritz Fellner. Wilhelm told Franz Joseph, "In this hard struggle it is of the greatest importance that Austria directs her chief force against Russia, and does not split it up by a simultaneous offensive against Serbia. In this gigantic struggle on which we are embarking shoulder to shoulder, Serbia plays a quite subordinate role." It was not what the Habsburg leaders wanted to hear, and, as will be seen presently, Conrad obeyed only reluctantly, and slowly. The message was, devote yourself to our war, because it is the important one, and postpone your war, which is unimportant, until we are in a position to turn our attention to minor matters. If one underlines the distinction between the two wars, it helps to answer many of the questions that always have been asked about the July crisis. One of them, posed in various guises from the very outset, is why peoples all around the planet were fighting and dying because of something that happened to two people, Franz Ferdinand and Sophie, of whom most knew nothing. The answer is, that was not why people on the far side of the world were fighting and dying. The local war between Austria and Serbia was connected with Franz Ferdinand and Sophie, but the Great War was not. The World War, which was not really the same conflict, was caused by the struggle for supremacy among the great European powers. The desire to be number one may have been a deplorable reason for starting a war, but it was neither surprising nor puzzling that it was what motivated the powers. Germany deliberately started a European war to keep from being overtaken by Russia. There was a certain parallel between the origins of the two wars. The Austro-Serbian War supposedly was triggered by the murders in Sarajevo, even though the Austrian plot against Serbia was hatched 2 weeks earlier. Similarly, the German government made use of a pretext to start a world war, and that pretext was the possibility that Russia might interfere in the Austro-Serbian War. Thus pretext was piled upon pretext, and dust was thrown in the eyes of posterity. The two wars were intertwined, but, to repeat, they were different and distinct, and in the end, Germany made Austria discard its own war in favor of Germany's. The German generals in July 1914 had taken advantage of their weeks of vacation to ponder their plans. They were not entirely isolated from events, they had made arrangements to be kept informed. They returned to Berlin calling for war. It was not for a war against Serbia. It was for the war against Russia, for which the Serbian crisis gave them an excuse. It should be noted that the Russians had done nothing yet when the German generals came back to Berlin July the 23rd to the 27th. The Russians had not intervened or interfered. They had undertaken only a minimal pre-mobilization, on July 26th. So what was driving up the temperature to fever pitch in Berlin was the prospect that the government could attack the Franco-Russian alliance in 1914 rather than later. The German generals had decided on war before Russia mobilized, July 31st, so, as pointed out earlier, it was not, as is claimed so often, Russian mobilization that started the war. So far as one can tell, the question Moltke agonized over, seemingly changing his mind, was whether to seize Liege instantly, as he absolutely needed to do, or whether to wait for Russia to order mobilization and thus provide his government with its excuse for declaring war. Once Russia obliged by ordering mobilization, the local and comparatively little Serbian war could be ignored and the world war of the great powers could start. Historians would write that the local Serbian war somehow had gotten out of control and had escalated into a global war. But the one did not grow into the other. On the contrary, one had to be put aside in order to start the other. Two wars, not one, that is the key. Sir Michael Howard, with his usual clarity, has explained what it is that has puzzled scholars of the First World War ever since. There was no logic to the German decision. Agreeing with Clausewitz that military plans have no inherent logic, Sir Michael writes, there was certainly no logic in the decision by the German General Staff that in order to support the Austrians in a conflict with Russia over Serbia, Germany should attack France, who was not party to the quarrel, and do so by invading Belgium. If you delete the italicized words, for we now see that Germany instigated the war against Russia on its own account, not Austria's, the puzzle is solved. And it shows that there was logic in the decisions of the German General Staff. It was not to support the Austrians that the German leaders had maneuvered in July. It was just the reverse, it was to secure Austria's support for themselves in their own war. Germany's generals had to perform the trick of first getting Austria involved in a war and then getting it to change its enemy. The wars were to some extent incompatible. One can see that, however, only if one first sees that there were two wars, not one.